Welcome everybody. Thanks for supporting us today. It's good to see you all. Actually, quite a few here now. So we've got 37, is it? Yeah. Now, we've got our old friend Brian Harvey. But before we start, let me just share my screen with you. So I'm going to talk about some other events and things that we've got coming up. If I can hit the right buttons, that is. Bear with me. Just going to go to the BIS website. So this is simply bis-space.com/events. So you can see for yourself what we've got coming up. So after today's talk here, we've got this Martin O'Toole talk next week, which looks quite interesting. Space Up Scotland's back. Good to see that. We've got a few other things, European Space Conference and European Astrofest, but we'll just skip past those. We get the social, the BIS social coming up soon as well, 12th of February. And then, would you believe, we're actually going to Worcester Comic Con. I got my arm twisted on that one. So we're going to see if it's possible, see if they're BIS types and they want to be, see if we can find some new members. I'm just going to sketch on. So the next one that we'll be doing is in March, and it's Alan Marlowe. Alan, I know you're here. I hope you're recording because he does our videos. He's going to be talking about pets in space. Again, if you are, there's quite a few of you are non-members, and quite a few of you are actually new to today as well. So it's good to see you for the first time if you are, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you like what you see and you think and you like all things space and you want to become part of our little group, that would be really great. Please have a look at the bis-space.com website, and you can become members for there. If you are young, and I don't know if you are or not, if you're under 25, it does not cost you a penny. You can join as a free membership for you. I'm going to stop sharing now. And but today, so we have it's our old friend Brian Harvey. Brian is journalist in the space industry. He's been in it for many years. He's done many talks for us, and he's written many books, of which most of us are actually avid readers. And this is, I think, this is in prep for his new book. And today's talk is cooperation or competition. It's a view on the current UK space world. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Brian. Brian, would you like to take over? And
Okay, right. Well, welcome to today. I've been asked to speak about cooperation or competition in the space world. I'm going to speak about who cooperates with who competes with who, why, how, and what can we learn from all that experience. Space cooperation goes back to the International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 8. It was proposed in 1950 against the background of the Cold War. It was originally to be the third polar year, but it became much wider than that, with two focus areas, the Arctic and especially the Antarctic, and space exploration. Its overall purpose was to rebuild post-war science. And it was hugely successful because 67 countries joined, including the Global South. It wasn't just a Northern Hemisphere show. 60,000 scientists, and it was most famous for the first satellite launches, Sputnik, Explorer, Vanguard, and so on. But some aspects of this, I think, were overlooked. First of all, it set down the ideal that science, and particularly space science, was neutral, above and apart from politics. The terms peaceful purposes were very strongly articulated, and European scientists in particular saw off an attempt in 1958 by NATO to build a NATO satellite. An important part was that there should be a free flow of scientists and scientific information, and indeed that is even still updated to the very present day. There was a series of mutual lecture tours by Sergei Vernov in the United States and James Van Allen in the Soviet Union. The results from the IGY were published very extensively, including in English. And this was despite the fact that both the USSR and the People's Republic of China, the PRC, were very much under Western sanction. So it was stood above that. There was strong popular enthusiasm for the year, a lot of educational activity around the year. There was a valuing of what are called second and third track diplomacy, by which I mean institutes, non-governmental organisations, the setting up of the Committee on Space Research, COSPAR, the United Nations Office of Space Affairs, the Committee of the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and it resolved most particularly the status of Antarctica. And this is relevant to the end of our story this afternoon. The US position in 1948 to the Department of State was that Arctica should only be available to the US and its allies. The USSR and also the PRC should be excluded. But once the IGY started in 1957, that attitude became really untenable anymore. And President Eisenhower did a complete 180-degree U-turn. Counterintuitively, he said, let's invite the USSR into Antarctica. Let's make Antarctica a demilitarized zone. I think the USSR was going to go to Antarctica anyway, but in 1959, this culminated in the Antarctic Treaty, which you see there, which set down the notion that the Antarctic should be for peaceful science purposes only, no military there, no mining there, and that is a success story that has endured to the present day. The first cooperation endeavour of the space age was in the 1960s, because the NASA Act of 1958 did not just permit, but it required cooperation. It was set down as a high-level objective. May I introduce you to the key personality of this, Arnold Fruitkin, and he was head of international affairs in NASA from 1959 to 79, and he defined by himself and led cooperation around what are called the Fruitkin principles, that we work in the area of projects, not programs, no exchange of funds, we're not paying anyone to do this, clean interfaces so that one country's implements, instruments, whatever, could interface cleanly with another. That NASA would deal with one agency in each country only, not a whole ton of them, and the publication of open results. And by the mid-1960s, NASA had cooperation agreements with no less than 69 countries. And that cooperation became the basis of medium to long-term relationships and friendships, which I would term as an alliance. And two of them in particular became permanent, Europe and Japan, and they endured to the present day. In 1959, NASA offered to launch for free satellites by European countries, in particular, and in this order, Britain, France, Italy, and Canada. Germany came later. And this was the first space alliance, I think, between the US and Europe. It was the most enduring and the most successful, followed by Japan. And there were a couple of particular themes to it. The most important one was called Post-Apollo. President Nixon said, wouldn't it be a great idea for us to fly foreign astronauts? It was his idea. And they very much became the gold currency of cooperation. He sent Thomas Paine, the head of NASA, on tour to Europe, to Japan and to Canada. And those negotiations were quite difficult, but they ended up with Europe providing Space Lab for the shuttle. And then the same idea was followed with the Freedom Station, when President Reagan invited in the same group of countries. And you see a famous picture there of President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher with a model of the Freedom Station, which later became the ISS. Europe contributed the Columbus module on it. That model, by the way, cost $40,000 to build and make and ship to Britain at the time, which kind of puts the price of Airfix kits at the time into perspective. Anyway, the US worked through ELDO, through ESRO, the European organizations, and through individual states. But in the course of American, European, and indeed Japanese cooperation, there were blazing rows, particularly over launchers. The US did not believe that Europe or Japan should have its own launchers. They did not want Europe or Japan or other countries launching their own communication satellites, ComSats, because that would threaten the American-based monopoly of Intelsat. And sometimes the US was not always a very reliable partner, pulling out of the International Solar Polar Mission, which we know as Ulysses, and then in ExoMars 2012. But, and this is the important thing here, this alliance, this cooperation greatly built up European capability in the space business. There was a lot of discussion in Europe because it had been ravaged by the war, even countries that had not been occupied like Britain, of Europe's backwardness. And nobody spoke of European backwardness from the 1980s onward. The US role greatly lifted the capacity of the European countries with whom it had cooperation. Sorry, I'm trying to get the next slide here. The second big cooperative area was Interkosmos. This was very much the initiative of the socialist countries. The USSR itself was very slow to develop cooperation in the post-war period. It was not approved until the Communist Party Congress of October 1961. The USSR was portrayed abroad as being uncooperative, but research would suggest that it just did not know how. It was slow to put institutions and mechanisms and people in place to do it. And the initiative was very much taken by a Polish space scientist, Jan Mergenthaler of Warsaw, who put it down on the agenda of the Academy of Sciences in 1962, and then specifically by Ernst August Lauter in April 1965 in the German Democratic Republic, who made a cooperation between the socialist countries a very specific proposal. And what changed? Brezhnev changed. In 1964, Brezhnev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He introduced what is now retrospectively called the late socialist period. He believed strongly in collegiality inside the Comecon countries and internationalism. Let's remember that these countries had to work together because they were all under Western, what are called COCOM sanctions. And Interkosmos was set up on the 31st of May 1966. Head of it was Boris Petrov, seen on the right. It was a highly structured, very intensively organized, systematized, methodical program, and they were programs, not projects. The one thing that makes them quite distinctive from the Fruitkin approach. But I think their value, their approach, their outcomes may have been underestimated. It's often portrayed as a propaganda exercise, but there was a huge amount of very real science carried out. It is also sometimes portrayed as a Soviet gift to the socialist countries, but there's a huge lot of evidence of technology transfer from these countries to the USSR, which sounds counterintuitive, but seems to be real. Interkosmos achieved 25 scientific satellites of very high scientific value, had instruments on interplanetary probes, and from 1978 introduced human spaceflight with the flight by Vladimir Remek of Czechoslovakia in 1978. And although it was Nixon's invention, it was Interkosmos that first put into practice the idea of seats into space. And I'd recommend the book by Colin Burgess and Bert Fiss, which describes this in great detail. It raised the space science capacity of the participant countries in a way that has not since been matched. And its legacy is the communications organization Intersputnik, which has not only survived the end of the communist period, but now has 25 states and is both successful and profitable.